Hello, and welcome to this meditation and reflection and worship experience for Wednesday, September 9th, 2020. I'm Pastor Adam Miller Stubendick, the intentional interim pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Williamsville, New York. I said during this month of September, we're going to spend some time talking about these concepts of change and transition and what that means for us and for the world and for all the things that we see and experience in church and in life and in faith. And if you recall, last week in this reflection, we talked about the first part of three parts of change and transition, and that is the ending. And there are three parts. There's the ending, there's the in-between, and then there's the new beginning. And so if last week we primarily talked about the ending, looking at the Israelites having to no longer function as slaves in Egypt, and looking at the disciples and what it meant for them to stop being fishers and to stop the other things that they did and follow Jesus. Any transition has an ending, a middle, and a new beginning. The opposite of writing a book, if you will. It has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Think of that in reverse, because you have to let go of something before something new can take place. So today we want to spend some time in that middle space, which in some ways, my role as the intentional interim pastor in this particular community and in the communities that I've served for the last many years is to be the physical embodiment of that in-between space for congregations, for this particular congregation, if you will, right now, between what was and what will be. So there's a lot of things to think about and talk about in this in-between space. So I like the words in-between time. I like thinking about the interim. I like the word liminal. Because these are words that resonate with the work that I do. I think they also are really important for our life right now. I speak to you in the middle of the first day back to school for anyone in Western New York in kindergarten through 12th grade. Potentially back to school. We know not everyone's back there right now. So I speak to you as school is trying to start. I speak to you as church is still in a different way with only one worship service on Sunday mornings here, with having a pause still on things like Christian education, Sunday school, Ladies' Aid, most of the other in-person things, choirs, of congregational life are still on pause. And so sometimes people have this desire to want to go back. And so this interim time, this liminal space, this neutral zone is the technical term for this time in some theories of change and transition. This neutral zone is a way that we don't know what we're moving into yet. And the first thing to figure that out is to let go of where we were. So I'm the embodiment in a human form of some of that liminal space, in between time, neutral zone life. So individuals and communities go through these three things of ending and neutral zone and new beginnings. It's not always a linear process. Sometimes we think we've let go of something, and then it circles back around and catches us in a new, surprising way. And sometimes we think we're in the middle of a neutral zone or a liminal space. And then we realize we're kind of already left that, or we're still back in the letting go of something. This is not always linear. Our lives individually and our lives communally circle around these three things all the time. So I want to spend some time thinking about the disciples today. We talked about how some of them used to fish, some of them were tax collectors, some of them were all the different roles. Some of their roles we know what they were before they dropped things and followed Jesus. Some of them we don't. But the first thing was the letting go of what was and following Jesus. And then we sometimes we like to joke about how the disciples were this group of people who Jesus constantly was frustrated with, and they seem to not get it a lot. And they're like, please tell us what this means, they ask Jesus all the time. Or Jesus says something in a larger gathering, and then he ends up re-explaining it to his disciples later. And I think some of that stuff in Scripture about the disciples that we hear and we read and is experienced, some of their lack of understanding what Jesus is trying to help them realize and what Jesus is preparing them for, is them living in this in-between liminal neutral zone. They've let go of their old life, and they still don't know what the new one's going to be. So sometimes, like a couple weeks ago in Scripture, we got Peter trying to tell Jesus, Jesus, no, you don't have to, stop talking about death and resurrection here. I came to follow you and said that you're the Messiah, and I expect a Messiah like a military powerful one. Because Peter hadn't quite finished he was still in the midst of the ending of his ways of understanding what Messiah meant. He was still in the middle of his ending, and he hadn't quite lived his neutral zone, his new way of life, to realize what Jesus was really leading him into this new beginning. This leader of the early church, this one who we put a lot of stock in as people of faith, and say, Peter's the rock on which the church was built. Well, we're not there yet. In most of the Scriptures, in fact, in just about all the Scriptures, Peter still doesn't get it. He's still trying to figure out what it means to be a follower of the ways of Jesus, and Jesus' ways in the world that are incredibly different than the way the world functions as they see it or we see it. So I would argue right now as a society, we are in a liminal space, an in-between time, neutral zone. Because we are in our 6th month of living with a global pandemic. We are in our 6th month of some different way of being because of the coronavirus. 6 months is a long time. And we are in all sorts of different places of the letting go end of this change and transition. Reminder, change is something is different. Transition is the emotional process to get from how things were to how things will be. So we're still living in this different time. And there are some people who I talk to at St. Paul's and in life in general, and some people that I read who keep talking about when we get back to whatever the thing may be, to worship looking the way it did before the pandemic, when we get back to going to the grocery store, going to the Bills home opener, whatever the thing may be, when we get back to it, a whole lot of folks are pining for that. Of course we're pining for it. We're pining for a sense of normalcy. And yet I also think, while pining for the way things were, we also know that if we're honest with ourselves, we're never really fully going back to the way things were. This global pandemic has fundamentally shifted a lot of our human experience. And we don't know what things are going to look like on the other side. We don't know how our day-to-day lives are going to be organized. We don't know how work is going to look, how school is going to look, how the other volunteer things that many people do, how those things are going to be structured. And so when we get scared, when we get scared with the unknown, which we all get scared with the unknown sometimes, we like to think and pine and hope for what we know, the way things were. Because that's a little bit easier on us, because those structures we're familiar with and we're used to. The harder work is to say, okay, things aren't going to return to the old way. We aren't sure what the new way is. And so how do we sit in this liminal, neutral, unknown place? And stay a little bit uncomfortable, because liminal space is uncomfortable, but also be like, okay, here's where we are. We don't know what the future brings. But we also know the past is not the present and future. This is really hard work for church. Really hard work for faith communities. And so I sit here and say today, as the intentional interim pastor of St. Paul's, that this is hard work. This letting go of the past, dwelling in the in-between. And if we don't do the first two parts, last week's part of the ending, and this week's part of the neutral zone, liminalness, in-between time, if we just try and rush to the new beginning that we're going to spend more time on next week, the new beginning gets very much muddled up in the past. And without some sort of space between the past and the future is harder. So I want to sit here today and invite you to think about, if we could recreate, I didn't even say that phrase right, because I don't want to recreate. If we could create St. Paul's Lutheran Church for 2022, what would we do? I'm not talking about, the building is full of people, or we've got a great choir and a great music program, or we baptized 17 kids in 2022. I'm not talking about those numerical markers or things like that. I'm talking about, how would we design our community? How would we set ourselves up? Knowing that the pandemic has changed everything, knowing that a long-term clergy couple of pastors retired, what could we imagine, hopefully, for that future? And sometimes our future gets so connected to the past, which is well and good, because you have to know your past to live a great future. But what if what's most important right now, for me, for you, for us together, is to say and do and dwell and think and play in this in-between time, so that we can fully unlearn what it means to be fishers like the disciples, unlearn what it means to be a tax collector like Matthew, unlearn what it means to be bound in slavery like the Israelites did. Unlearn that reality so that we can imagine the future in new and different ways. Sometimes an analogy for the liminal space is a bridge. And it's a bridge where at some point you know the old bank on the one side. So you're walking from that bank and you're in the middle of a suspension bridge over something. And you aren't sure what the bank for the future is, because you're not there yet. But you're in this in-between space. So at some point you also realize, we're not going backwards. So we're going to have to figure out a new future. And so this analogy doesn't work, because if you didn't have a bank on either side, your bridge is going to fall down, but work with it anyway. We can't go back to the old bank of the past. And we don't know where the new bank is, so we're suspended on a suspension bridge and building towards a future that we don't know exactly what it is. So one of my two most important things to think about in this, for you and for me and for us, is another way to look at this, is that we're getting in a car and driving to California. We're leaving New York. We know we're leaving New York. We know we're going to California. And for quite a while, all we really have to do is point the car west. We don't need to know the exact address in California we're driving to right now. We just need to point the car west and start driving. And that's my encouragement for us right now as a faith community. That's my encouragement for us right now as a society. Let's not go back. Let's be informed by the past, live in this unknown future, and live in this unknown present, and prepare for a brighter future. So that the most important things that we need to do right now is something called take the next faithful step. And I learned this from a leadership cohort I was a part of through the Lewis Center for Leadership out of Wesley Seminary in D.C. And it's simply this. We don't have to know all the steps to the marathon to get to California. We don't have to do them all right now. But what we have to do right now is figure out what's the next faithful step. So that's why I'm doing these recordings about change and transition and something new and something different here in September, is to give you some of this language to think about for our life of faith together and for your world, the rest of your life as well. We don't have to know it all right now. But what we have to do right now is take the next faithful step. And once we take one step towards a new future that we aren't sure what it is, then we can take the next one and the next one and the next one. So the first steps are the letting go and the ending and living in this place of a little bit of tension and this place of a little bit of challenge that is the unknown. We don't know who St. Paul's next pastor will be. We don't know what St. Paul's is going to look like the other side of this global pandemic. We don't know all that stuff. We know we have some work to do together. We know we have some hopes and some ideas and probably some fears about what the future might be, some hopeful imagination towards it, and some scary imagination of what we don't want it to be. Two last things. In this letting go, this ending, and this neutral zone, liminal space, and in a new beginning, we don't have to know it all, but I do believe and trust, and I hope you do too, we don't do this stuff alone. Our good and faithful and life-affirming God journeys with us on this path. So that's the biggest thing. Whenever you feel alone, or we feel alone, or we feel like we got to do it all by ourselves, God goes with us and invites us to imagine a more hopeful, more life-affirming, grander future than any of us can, because God's church is bigger and grander and more than I can imagine, than you can imagine, than we collectively can imagine. God's understanding is more. So we can always lean into the ways of God in our life of faith and in our lives in all the corners of them, knowing that God's got a big desire for us and for the world, and that we have a part to play. Our next faithful steps are a part to play. What's our part in living the full, beautiful vision of God's desires for us and for our neighbors and for the planet. So God is with us in this work. The second thing I want you to think about today is that in this mode of ending, neutral, and new, there's an ending and a neutral, and then there's a beginning. We don't like endings very well. We are, as people of faith who believe in Jesus, we are people that know that endings have to come before something new can show up. Think of the resurrection story. There's no resurrection without death. So the first thing is to know Jesus' death happened. And then remember there was 3 days in the middle when everyone was like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? I don't know. The women came to the tomb early on that first Easter morning, not knowing what they were going to find, worried, concerned, grieving that their friend, the one they followed, their teacher, was dead. They came to do their final act for his death. But then they found this neutral, different, empty tomb. They discovered that new life had already begun. That Jesus was resurrected and was going to call them and us into a new life that on Good Friday there was no way they could imagine. So we are in a Holy Saturday people right now, knowing that there's resurrection because we know the Easter story. So God goes with us in the midst of this all. And as Christian people of faith, we are death and resurrection people. So if you want to muse on particular things today, muse on the hopes and dreams for the future of this place. And the other thing that you can muse on, and you can talk to me about it, is what are the things that need to die so that new life can happen? What ways of thinking, what particularities of this community of faith need to go away, need to be let go of, so that new life can spring forth? Well, that's a hard thing for people who care greatly about a congregation to imagine and think about. But we are death and resurrection people, so let's live like it. One of my favorite hymns of death and resurrection that I'm going to sing here as we conclude this reflection today is Now the Green Blade Rises. Because it has some death and resurrection motif in it. And I want you to remember that let go, in between, and then new is hard, faithful work. It's the work of the church. We follow one who did those things, who died, and for 3 days lay dead, and then was raised to new and different and changed life. Not just for Jesus, but for us all as well. God is with you in the endings. God is with you in the liminal space. And God is with you in the new life to come. We sing Now the Green Blade Rises, which is number 379 in Evangelical Lutheran worship. Now the green blade rises from the buried grain, wheat that in darketh many days has lain. Love lives again, that with the dead has been. Love is come again, like wheat rising green. In the grave they laid him, loved by hatred slain, thinking that he would never wake again. Laid in the earth, like grain that sleeps unseen. Love is come again, like wheat rising green. Forth he came at Easter, like the risen grain. He that for 3 days in the grave had lain, raised from the dead, my living Lord is seen. Love is come again, like wheat rising green. When our hearts are wintry, grieving or in pain, your touch can call us back to life again. Fields of our hearts that dead and bare have been, love is come again, like wheat rising green. No matter where you feel you are in this day of the endings, neutral and new beginnings, love has come again. In the grieving, love has come again. In the unknown, love has come again. In the newness,